Hey,
Hey, can you see me?
yes, I could see you. Could you see me?
I can. Yeah.
You could. Excellent. All right, I could hear you well too. So great to have you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much in these troubling times to be willing to help out and share your vast knowledge of Cuba and Latin America to my students. I know they'd appreciate it too.
No problem. And I can send you some pictures on Facebook of some like the monuments and stuff that I've seen in some museums that I went to while I was there.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd love that. I could incorporate that when I upload the video. So
Okay.
thank you so much again. So
No problem.
I guess we could get going. So yeah, just tell us about yourself.
So my name is Marvin Alonzo Greer. I'm the Education and Visitor Experience Lead at the Soldiers Memorial Military Museum in St. Louis, Missouri. And we are one entity that's part of the Missouri Historical Society, which is the Missouri History Museum, the Library and Research Center, which is our archives and we house our collections, and then we have our Military Museum, which is Soldiers Memorial Military Museum. And in my free time, I do living histories. And so I'm part of a group called the Sons and Daughters of Ham, and we interpret the lives of African Americans during the American Civil War on the civilian side. And then we formed a military group called the Hannibal Guards. And so we talk about the United States colored troops and the contributions of African Americans in the military. My area of expertise is African Americans in the military, and then I started dabbling in becoming interested in the history of Latin America and the Hispanic community here in the United States, as well as the histories of kind of American imperialism and American expansionism, and how the United States interacts with the world, especially with our brothers and sisters in South and Central America and the Caribbean.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that. So let's go with our first question here. So can you briefly describe Cuba's colonial history as a resource exporting economy, just for some historical context?
Okay, so Cuba, for most of its history, at least most of its modern history, from 1492 well up until 1991, has been a country that's been colonized or an island that's been colonized. So when we talk about the colonial period in Cuba, most people focus on that Cuba being a Spanish colony, but we'll talk about it being colonized by the United States and Russia after a little later on in this conversation. But the first part of kind of the Cuban history that you're talking about being an exporting economy was when Christopher Columbus and sailors from Spain stumble upon Cuba in 1492. They had an indigenous population that was living there of Taínos, and those individuals were quickly subjugated by the Spanish, and then Cuba becomes part of the Spanish Empire. In 1526, the Spanish government starts importing enslaved Africans to Cuba, and Cuba quickly becomes a tobacco and sugarcane exporter or sugar exporter, um, and pretty much it was the Cuba itself was the pretty much the golden island. It was the favorite island of and favorite colony of the Spanish Empire up until the Spanish Empire crumbled. It was um, it was uh, it was really Spain's last colonial holding in their empire. While Spain lost most of its colonies in South and Central America and mostly in the Caribbean, Spain still controlled Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam and the Philippines. Later on, Puerto Rico and uh, and Guam and the Philippines and to some extent Cuba would all become American territories or colonies. But that being said, there was a series of wars because of the exploitation due to the enslaved labor for the production of sugarcane and tobacco. The enslaved people and also colonial Cubans rebelled against numerous times
Wow.
against the Spanish government. Starting in about 1868, and ranging until 1898, there was a series of rebellions that took place off and on throughout Cuban history. Ironically, veterans from the American Civil War on both North and South side went to volunteer and fight on the rebel side during some of those wars.
That's fascinating. So yeah, the conditions were so terrible that they wanted to rebel against colonial rule.
Oh yes,
Very
the
interesting.
conditions. Yeah, conditions on Cuban sugarcane and sugar producing plantations were atrocious. Um, there's no type of slavery that is good,
Right.
and it's not a Olympics of suffering. But some of the worst places that one could have been enslaved, especially in the Caribbean, is on a sugar producing plantation. The hours were long. The heat was exhausting. It was dangerous because you have these huge cauldrons that are several feet high, taller than a person, and that are just massive. Imagine um, uh, something the size of, I've seen these before. I just don't. I would say probably like maybe 20 feet high by maybe
Uh-huh.
20 feet wide. These things were just massive, and you had to have people that stood on the edge of them
Jeez.
and stirred while these things were boiling, and people are falling in,
Oh my
and
God.
that was just the life of an enslaved person in Cuba or anywhere in the Caribbean that was producing um, these types of raw materials that are being shipped to the United States, that are being shipped to England, to France, to Spain. Uh, the abolitionist movement throughout Europe used to say, in every lump of sugar, there's a drop of human blood, and that's what they would say to get people to stop buying sugar because of the conditions um, on plantations and in sugar producing areas. Americans were not exempt from our uh, our interest in the colonial production of sugar. The largest slave trading family in American history, the family um, that uh, that founded Brown University, which is still in existence today. They made
Wow.
their money building ships in New England. They built these ships. They would take their ships to Africa to buy people. They would then take these people to Cuba, and they would trade them and sell them for raw materials, or for that sugar, and then they would sell those materials into the United States. This was the DeWolf family. They became so wealthy that they created their own triangle slave trade, where they didn't have to, they cut out the middleman. They bought their own plantations, they bought their own refineries in Cuba, so no longer did they have to buy and sell and trade people in Cuba for that sugar cane. They could actually drop those enslaved people off, have them produce it, and then sell those materials back to the United States. So they
Wow.
Yeah, there's a great documentary that was created by their descendant. Her name is Katrina Brown, and she created a documentary called Traces of the Trade, and it's all about her family's involvement in the slave trade, and that takes place in Cuba.
Yeah, you're saying that the United States is not um they're not set aside. They participated in colonialism and imperialism. So I think that goes right into our next question. So how did that history of exploitation of human beings for raw materials and resources, how did that impact Cuba after they got their independence from Spain?
So I would say that it dovetails right into that.
Yeah.
So Cubans are fighting for years for their independence. The Spanish are a very proud people. They don't feel like they can surrender to colonial subjects. The majority of the Cuban army in 1898, when the Americans get involved, the majority of the Cuban army are Cuba had already or Spain had already abolished the slave trade or slavery in Cuba by this point,
Yeah.
but they're still exploiting the Cuban people, and the majority of the people that are being exploited are people who are Afro-Cuban. If you go to Cuba today, people don't really consider themselves Afro-Cuban; they consider themselves just Cuban. It's not like the United States where people say, "Oh, you're black or you're white." In Cuba, you're just a Cuban. Now they do see people color differences, but if we're talking from the historical context, um, Afro-Cubans are people who we would identify, we as Americans would identify as being black. They're still the people who are mainly working in these cane fields. They're mainly the people being exploited. But black and white Cubans start galvanizing together to fight back against the Spanish. They pretty much take over the entire island, but the major hubs of Havana and Santiago and the major cities are still held in kind of in fortified cities by Spain. Spain is running out of money. Their soldiers have terrible morale, and then the U.S. Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. This gives Spain its out. It was not an intended consequence, but it gives them their out. It allows for the United States to come into Cuba and fight on the side of the Cuban rebels, or called the Mambi, M-A-M-B-I. That's what the Cuban rebels were called. And once this happens, within a few months, the Spanish surrender. They give up their last holdings in the world. They give up Cuba. They give up Puerto Rico. They give up Guam, and they give up the Philippines. America takes the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico as territories and protectorates, and we give Cuba its independence. The United States does issue the Platt Amendment, and the Platt Amendment says that Cuba has its independence. However, the United States has the right to come in and protect U.S. interests and meddle in Cuban affairs at any point in time that we see fit. So
Yes.
in Cuba, you'll hear this called this time period in 1898 called Neocolonialism. So if you go to Cuba today and you go on a tour, you hear a lot about the neocolonial time. They'll hear about the colonial time period, which involves Spain, and you'll hear about neocolonialism, which is Cuban independence. However, the United States kind of is big brother saying, okay, this is what you can do, this is what you cannot do. And those resources, those conditions in sugarcane fields and tobacco fields really didn't get a lot better. America exports white supremacy to Cuba for the first time. Under the flag of Cuba Libre, this idea that all Cubans were one. They're fighting for Cuban independence and Cuban freedom. Black Cubans and white Cubans fought equally side by side in this revolution. That does not mean that racism did not exist in Cuba, but how we would perceive racism today did not exist at that time amongst the Cuban rebels. But once the United States gets in charge, many of those the black Cuban leaders were marginalized, and the white Cuban leaders were lifted up. And we really America was going through Jim Crow at this time. So Plessy versus Ferguson, which you may have heard about in your classrooms, was happening in the 1890s. This idea of separate but equal is all happening right here during this pivotal time period. So the United States takes this idea of white supremacy and implants it on Cubans, which goes through a huge shift in how Cuba operated. In 1912, black Cubans protest about discrimination that's being instituted on part of the Cuban government.
Right.
And the U.S. because this was affecting businesses, because these people are factory workers. These people are working on the sugarcane fields. These people are working on the tobacco fields. This affected U.S. interests. So because of the Platt Amendment, U.S. troops are able to go there, and there's huge massacres of protesters, and many of them were veterans of the War of 1898. These men who had fought and were guides and scouts and fought side by side with U.S. soldiers during the War of Independence are now being looked on as traitors because they're black and protesting inequality in Cuba.
They were massacred.
Yes, massacred.
So they were massacred in the interests of U.S. corporations,
Yes.
right? So that's the whole thing. I'm trying with my students. We learn about imperialism in Africa with the scramble for Africa and how they divided and conquered. But that same thing was happening right here in our backyard in Cuba and Latin America. We were dividing and conquering by race, and I think he did a great job making us aware of that.
Oh yeah, and there are statues to some of these Cuban generals who were killed during these early time periods. If you the first time I went to Cuba, I went, and I'll send you this picture. And I go to there's a park there because people don't have the internet in their homes
Right.
just yet in Cuba. So you have to go to these parks where you can get Wi-Fi. So we go there one morning and to get our Wi-Fi, and I see this statue of a gentleman who clearly has African features, and I'm like, oh, I want to see who this guy is. So I
Yeah,
walk up,
cool.
and it's Quintin Banderas, who was a Afro-Cuban general from the Revolution, who actually was killed in 1912 during
Oh my God.
this time period. And it was so the Cuban people still honor these people who fought against racism and white supremacy even today in the 21st century.
That's amazing. Okay, so kind of like a review, you gave a really good discussion for us about Cuba's colonial history under Spain. So we
Yes.
have already like over 200, 300 years of history of slavery, giving resources to Spain, making them wealthy at the expense of the Cubans.
Oh, yes.
Then we have when they're fighting for their independence in the later half of the 1800s.
So the
Yeah,
War of Independence, 1868. There's pauses along the way, but there's
right.
1868 to about a 30-year time period, 1868 to 1898.
And wasn't slavery abolished in the 80s, 1880s?
Yes, I believe so.
About,
Yeah.
but still, as you said, the conditions were still there. Even though the laws were abolished, slavery was abolished, it was still
So it's
basically, yeah,
so it would be comparing American slavery to sharecropping or Jim
yeah,
Crow,
same.
where yes, you are free, but you're not equal. You don't have the resources. You're still treated less than. And the way that laws are written are still people have the right to abuse you.
Yeah.
You're, the landlords, your former owners still have rights to do terrible things to you, even though you are now free.
So then they fight for their independence, and then the United States swoops in
Oh yes,
at 1900, like right at the beginning of the 20th century. They swoop in, and then with the Platt, Platt amendment,
yes.
they basically say, all right, Cuba, you could rule yourselves, but you have to do what we say. We're kind of like the big brother.
Yeah, the idea was that these people, Cubans, aren't responsible enough. And this was eugenics was very big during this time period, the scientific racism. And so if you look at, especially if you look at political cartoons from this time period, one of my favorites, and I'll send it to you. Not favorite because it's awesome, but favorite is it shows how Americans viewed the rest of the world. Um, it shows Uncle Sam, and he's teaching children, and they're a bunch of white kids, and they have their books open. It tell each state's like
Yeah.
it's like Alaska and California and Texas, and then in front you have the brown children of Puerto Rico and Guam, and the Philippines and Cuba, and and it's showing that Uncle Sam has to teach these people who are not ready to govern themselves because they are either black or brown, or part of the Latinx community, or Asian, and because of that, we as Americans have to teach people how to govern themselves because they are not responsible enough to govern themselves.
It sounds very similar to what's going on in Africa with the white man's burden.
Oh, very similar.
Right. So, okay, so then you have the United States coming in, and they're specifically using white supremacy to divide the Mambi or the.
Yes, mom. So the Mambi was the army,
Okay,
but
or
now
Cubans.
the Cuban government, they're trying to instill white supremacy so that it happened in Africa. It happens all over the place where you say the lighter people are going to be in charge. You're going to be our rulers. You're going to be the bankers. You're going to be the doctors. We'll give you more resources. We're going to support you because you look more like us. So white Cubans, people who were either directly of Spanish descent or were from because Cuba was not just Africans and Spaniards, but there were people from all over the world who had
Right.
immigrated to Spain. I mean to Cuba, and so the people who were more fair skinned, who resembled what Americans at the time thought was beautiful and acceptable, those individuals were given power, which tended to be those white Cubans.
and that divides and conquers the population.
Oh yes.
So, and then one last thing before we get to our third question. What could you just briefly describe again? What's like the main goal of the United States here? Like, what's their goal in Cuba here?
The main goal was businesses, to support American businesses, to support those American companies that are producing rum, that are producing cigars, that are refining sugar to export. So these American companies can come in, they can make massive profits. So like Bacardi rum. Today, Bacardi is known as is based out of Puerto Rico, but was founded in Cuba and as an American company. But after the revolution, we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah.
Uh, you see these companies have to leave, and so these companies are able, under the Platt Amendment, under this neocolonialism, American companies are able to go into Cuba and really exploit the resources. What's going on in Africa today for cobalt and a lot of those resources today, where the Chinese and American companies are going and getting oil and natural resources. The same thing is happening in Cuba during this time period.
Okay. Yeah, so it seems like the United States, like who's really getting service in Cuba? Who's getting first priority? Cubans or corporations, like US interest? It's business. They're
Oh,
getting more. Okay. So now let's fast forward to the 1950s. Uh Particularly 1959. So the Cold War is going on between the United States and Russia, and as my students know, the United States is very nervous about communism spreading in its backyard, um, and all throughout Latin America. And we know that there was communist movements in places like Guatemala and Central America. But what makes Cuba so important in this story of resistance to U.S. imperialism? So could you describe the Cuban Revolution for me?
so the Cuban Revolution starts, I guess, as far back as I guess the 19. I guess it starts really in the 1950s, but I would say starts with the birth of Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara, two men who meet in Mexico as medical students. They were not trained necessarily leaders, or guerrilla fighters, for that matter, but they were left leaning. They weren't necessarily communist uh, by definition initially,
Okay.
but there was such corruption going on in Cuba at the time. Castro um, convinces his new friend Che that they should go with his brother Raul, and get this army and come to Cuba and liberate it from the corruption that was going on at the time. The president was a man named Fulgencio Batista, and Batista was a former Cuban soldier who rebelled and had a coup, overthrew the president of Mexico at the time. I'm sorry, of Cuba at the time,
Yeah.
and he ruled for a number of years. He stepped down. Um, Another president was elected, and then Batista came back and overthrew him, and really got in bed with the American mafia. Cuba was literally run by the American mob. Probably one of the most influential mob bosses of the time, um, a man named Meyer Lansky, a Jewish, probably the most successful mob boss, I would say, of American history. Meyer Lansky, if you guys look him up, he's a fascinating person in U.S. history. Contemporaries with Lucky Luciano and people like that. Anyways, but the American mafia is running Cuba with um, with Batista. There's brothels, there's gambling. Meanwhile, the people of Cuba especially in the countryside, are starving. Um, there's lack of resources. American companies are running amok. The mafia is literally running Cuba um, like any other place that they would run. And so Fidel Castro, his brother Raul, and Che Guevara and their supporters, they land on the beaches of Cuba, and they start a rebellion in 1953.
Okay.
Again, this is not a communist revolution. They're just trying to overthrow the corrupt government, and they fail. Batista makes a major flaw for a dictator, which is it's good for the person involved, but not good for the dictator. When the rebellion fails or the coup fails, he does not execute Che Guevara. He doesn't execute Castro and his brother. He exiles them and says, "Get off the island. Pretty much leave." Well, um, as we know, years later, Castro comes back, starting a guerrilla war in the mountains of Cuba. He's aided by many of those Afro-Cubans, those people from the countryside, the same people who in the 19th century were the backbone of that Cuban independence movement from Spain. Their descendants become the backbone of the revolution. These people are many of them are illiterate. They don't know how to read and write, because under Batista, those resources for education, for healthcare, those aren't going to the average Cuban. Those are going to the people, the wealthy elite. Those are going to the mafia members. And so, Castro and his men start being supported by the people in the rural communities, and this gains support. Eventually, in 1959, the revolution Castro's revolution succeeds, and Castro marches into Havana and captures the city. Batista is able to flee, and he leaves Cuba. And it's not really until the 1960s that Castro's government becomes a communist government. They were already left-leaning. They did not agree with the capitalist ideas of the United States, especially because the United States did nothing to stop the mafia from running amok and organized crime from running Cuba.
Yeah, why not? Why didn't they do that?
We don't know. It wasn't the Platt Amendment wasn't really in effect by that point in time. American businesses are still making money. There was no interest in doing the morally right thing and stopping organized crime, because it was benefiting American businesses. It wasn't harming it.
Okay.
And Batista acted as a puppet for the United States. So whatever we said, whatever the mafia said, kind of went. And so those. But in 1961, with the Cold War going on, the Cuban government, especially Castro's new fledgling government, they need an ally. They need someone powerful that can help them start up this new economy, because the economy has been flattened because of civil war. They can't ally themselves with the United States because they're starting because these businesses have been kicked out, or at least are being threatened to be kicked out. So the Soviet Union leans in and says, "Hey, we'll help you." Probably not for necessarily a moral reason. I don't think the Russians thought like, "Oh, this is the right thing to do." But how can the Russians poke the United States in the eye? Well, we can offer assistance to this new upstart government, and so the Soviets embrace Castro, and in 1961, the United States tries to overthrow the Castro regime with a CIA-backed coup known as the Bay of Pigs. It was the Bay of Pigs invasion, where Cuban exiles and counter-revolutionaries were trying to go into Cuba and overthrow the population. They didn't understand how much support Castro had at that time, and so Castro called for a massive uprising of the people to help defend the revolutionary ideals, and the Bay of Pigs failed. At that point in time, Castro does lean into communism and declares that his government is going to be a communist government, which then spawns a whole host of political issues that deals with the United States and the Soviet Union.
Right. So now the United States is paying attention, because not only are the businesses failing because Cuba is pushing them out, Fidel's pushing them out, but now they call themselves communist, and Russia is helping them out. Great. So could you give us some more perspective on this Castro's government? Because we know the what is it called? The Cuban Missile Crisis occurs in this time period. So could you give some context there?
1962. So in 1961, you have the Bay of Pigs. 1962, the year after that, as a result, because the U.S. government, we claimed for many years that we had nothing to do with the Bay of Pigs. It was spontaneous, even. But because of the Bay of Pigs, the Castro regime is upset. The U.S. tried to overthrow their regime, their government. The U.S. planted missiles in Turkey, facing the Soviet Union or Russia. Um, and in retaliation, the Russians asked that if Cuba would allow them to put nuclear missiles on Cuba, and Cuba is only 90 miles from the United States,
Right.
uh, and so this sets the United States and the world into a frenzy because it only takes one nuclear weapon to destroy the world. I know many countries
Yeah.
have, but I don't. We have probably thousands of nuclear weapons just today in the United States. But it
Right.
only takes one to destroy everything.
Yep.
So I know my parents told me growing up that they always had to do duck and cover drills. Today, schools do active shooter trainings, sometimes
Yeah.
do fire drills. But for that time period, for the 1950s and 60s, and probably early 70s, the duck and cover uh, was the rule of the day. And you can find some amazing video. It's an amazing video, like a cartoon online. You can find on YouTube of the
Yeah.
duck and with the turtle.
Bert the turtle. Yep.
Yep.
So yeah, so the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you think that that would be an example of Russian imperialism?
Oh yes. So this is so the neo-colonial period ends with the revolution, and the revolutionary time period from 1959 until 1991. Really, Russia kind of pulled the strings, not completely, but definitely was a Russian was kind of Russia kind of was a Russian empire. Cuba was an island. They didn't have a lot of trading partners. The United States put in an embargo so that the Russians could not get those resources. I mean, so the Cubans could not get those
Right.
resources. So who was their major trading partner? The Soviet Union. So if you go to Cuba today, you'll see a lot of old American cars, Chevys and Fords, but you'll also see a lot of 1970s and 80s Russian cars
So
because
cool.
who's importing the cars? Who's importing the technology? Um, there is a huge Russian radio station that's still I don't think it's operational today, but the tower is still there, and the Russians would be able to one broadcast as well as look out and pretty much survey all of Havana. Um,
Wow.
yeah, so the Russians really controlled a lot of what was going on in Cuba uh, well up until 1991.
So and you keep hinting at this, but you have been to Cuba.
Yes, I've been to Cuba
Right.
twice.
So I think this would be great for a question here, one of our other questions. So, what were the long-term impacts of the Cuban Revolution and the Cold War in Cuba, and how does that affect Cuba today?
The long impacts. I think the long impacts are that this the Cuban War of Independence, because the founders of the War of Cuba Libre, or the War of Cuban Independence, many of them died in battle. People like Jose Marti, who I would definitely stress that your students look him up, look up his writings. He dies in battle. He was a writer. He was a poet. Um, he talks about um, the equality of the races in Cuba, and so not having black Cubans and white Cubans, but just Cubans.
Cubans.
Um, I would People like he and Antonio Maceo, the Bronze Titan, who was another Afro-Cuban general. These men were killed in battle. Their ideals unfortunately died with them, and so the failures of their predecessors, those that came after them, to live up to the ideals of Cuba Libre and this idea of one Cuba, I think allowed for the United States to come in and corrupt at least an idea. Not saying that that wouldn't have happened if the United States hadn't, but we don't know. We will never know.
So you're saying that Jose Marti and all that was the revolutionary, like way back, like the
Yeah,
1800s.
yeah, 1800s.
Okay.
So when Castro took over, um, although he was probably more on the socialist side, he was not an avowed communist until the U.S. Kind of pushed him towards that realm. I think we as the long lasting legacies for us today is listening to people. How can we, even though we don't necessarily agree politically with individuals, can we listen to them? Can we see what ideas they may have that are good? Can we see what ideas that are bad? Castro's regime did some terrible things. They murdered thousands of people, imprisoned millions, cracked down on freedom of speech. Almost any revolutionary time period, whether it's in Cuba, whether it's in China, in places in Africa, even here in the United States during our revolution, during our revolutionary era, there were crackdowns of freedom of speech, suppression of human rights. So the legacy of the Cuban Revolution, I believe, is one that's still being written, because this idea of this Cuban Revolution is alive and well with the Cuban people today. Younger Cubans that I've met while there, and by younger I mean people that were born after the revolution. Those individuals, they want the same things that young Americans want. They want to be able to travel. They want to be able to have free and fair elections. They have elections in Cuba, but it's pretty much you vote for your town representative. Your town representative votes for your county representative. Your county representative then votes for your state representative, and your state representative votes for the national person. So it's pretty much all rigged. But they don't want that system anymore. They also the people that I've met said they don't want McDonald's. They don't want huge Walmarts. They don't want those huge corporations that don't exist in Cuba today. They enjoy having the free healthcare they have. They enjoy having free education. Yes, there is inequality that exists that's still in Cuba. If you're wealthier, you can have more access. But that's because capitalism has been trickling more and more into Cuba. So I think the legacy of the revolution is the legacy of the world. And it's a history that's still yet to be written, because we are people, and we're currently writing our own history and our own destinies. Many of the older Cubans that I met while I was there still feel that they're very loyal to the Castro and the revolution, and they don't like many of the changes because that's not what they grew up with. That's not what they fought for as young people, young women and young men. And they're probably pretty resentful toward the United States for the meddling in Cuban affairs through assassinations attempts on Castro, the Bay of Pigs, and things of that nature. But we, as the younger generations, that's not our history. That's not our legacy. That's not something that we grew up with. So I think it's up to us, your students, people that are a little bit older. We are the ones who will be inheriting this U.S.-Cuba relations, and it's up to us to see what kind of relationship we want with Cuba in the future.
That's wonderful. One last question to go off what you're saying. It's our responsibility and my students' responsibility to develop this relationship. We want the same things, but it seems like there's so many burdens from this history. What are some major obstacles that we all have to face in order to write this new history with Cuba?
That's a great question. So I will say, both the Cuban Americans that I know, people that live here in Cuba, live here in the United States, are of Cuban ancestry or from Cuba, and the Cuban people that I've met in my travels to Cuba, they are some of the nicest, just best people you will ever meet. They are friendly. Strangers in Cuba will invite you into their homes and cook for you, and just having just conversations. And I think that's what we need more of. Conversations. We as Americans sometimes feel that we are always right. Our way of doing things is the right way because we're Americans. Of course, we're the greatest country on earth. So everyone of course wants to live here, which is not the case. So I think traveling, talking to people from different backgrounds, whether it's from Cuba or elsewhere in the world, hearing their perspectives, not always assuming that we as Americans are right or me as Marvin Alonzo Greer is always right, but being able to agree to disagree, asking questions, asking more questions about people's culture, about people's history, experiencing the different foods and different cultures. Um, the Cuban people that I've met in my travels there were not resentful of American history. Some of the older people may have been, but the
Yeah.
people that are in your students' generations and our generations, um, they were open to having discussions and dialogue about history. The the museums and the history they presented in Cuba were way different than what we are taught as Americans.
Yeah.
Um, uh, we really don't talk about the Bay of Pigs. They have an entire museum dedicated to talking about the revolutionary time period in the Bay of Pigs. Um, and so I think exploring, being open to hearing different perspectives, and having grace to say, you know what, I might be wrong. Like,
Yeah.
let me think about the way I think of things. Because there's things that my parents told me growing up that as I got older, I was like, huh, you know what? That may have not been the correct way of thinking. I still love my parents to death. They are great people, but um, that was a way of the past,
Mm.
something that their life experiences told them that they should believe. And so my life experiences are going to teach me something different, and it's okay to change.
That's great. So I think we could end there. Thank you so much for your
No
help,
problem.
for your insight, for your expertise on Cuba, and hopefully, yeah, that's a great place to end. We could move forward, have dialogue with people from not only Cuba but other Latin American countries who have been impacted by neocolonialism,
Oh yeah.
and realize that as Americans, we have a responsibility to listen and understand that many of the actions that our country did in this time period had devastating effects in these parts of the world. And what we might have learned is not correct, or what might not be, as we talk to other people, might not be correct. So I think that's what we should. I agree with you. We should be talking with more people, and I'm glad that that I took this step and interviewed you because you really did contribute a lot to us. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank
Really
you.
appreciate it. You stay healthy, okay?
It's the same.
Take care, and we'll keep in touch,
Okay, please
okay?
do it. I'll send you some pictures of my travels and some other things.
Please. Thank you, thank you. All right. Take care then.
See ya.
Bye bye.